Hi, Carrie, and thanks for
Good morning.
joining us this morning. This is a program that we'd like to have as part of the um, Leadership Academy for county officials. So I really appreciate your willingness to talk about disaster preparedness, especially for county officials. So welcome.
Good morning. I am really glad to be able to do this today. And as Anne knows, it's disaster preparedness is something that I've been involved in since the floods of 2008. My particular unit sits very close to the Mississippi River, and so as we all know, in 2008 we had flooding all up and down the western side of Illinois, as well as the entire Midwest. So as my involvement in disaster preparedness planning and mitigation got involved, we decided that it would be beneficial to have just a little brief PowerPoint that I'm going to run through for you today on things that county officials need to know about disaster preparedness, because I'm pretty sure none of you got involved in county government because you wanted to deal with disaster preparedness. So this is just sort of one of those things that unfortunately most county officials will run into at some point during their tenure as a county official. Uh, there we go. Sorry about that. So I got involved, as I said, in 2008, and a colleague of mine who's since retired got me involved in an organization called the Extension Disaster Education Network. And Eden is a network that involves all of the extension services in the United States, including all land grant colleges, which are like the University of Illinois and Purdue and Indiana. Each state has a land grant institution, but also we work with Sea Grant and we work with the 1890 extension services, which are attached to historically Black colleges in the South. And all of us work together to share information, to develop programming, and we look at all aspects of extension programming, including agriculture, youth development, and family life. So when we start talking about local officials' capacity and knowledge in disaster preparedness, most of you are sitting there thinking, we have an emergency manager. What do I need to know? Well, the pictures that you're seeing on this slide, those are actually pictures from Roanoke, Illinois, which is a small little town in central Illinois, for those of you who aren't from central Illinois. And it's a Caterpillar supplier, a parts supplier for Caterpillar. And the owner of this company actually went to a business preparedness webinar or seminar, and they talked about, planning to stay in business should a disaster hit. So when they built this beautiful new facility that you can see right there, he had made disaster preparedness part of everything they did, had contingency plans, trained some of his staff as storm spotters, had safe rooms built in the restrooms and locker rooms in the facility. So even though this was the middle of a workday, and the picture on your right is the picture after the tornado went through, there was not a single fatality and no major injuries after this tornado. And no one lost a day's pay. His operations were done so that he had off-site places for people to work. They never missed a contract with Caterpillar. So that just is a visual illustration of what disasters can do quickly and how you can be prepared. When I look at that right side picture, I can't fathom that no one was injured during that. But so hopefully preparedness in our counties can help other organizations be as prepared as this company was for a disaster. The 5 things that I try to focus on when talking with local officials or anyone really is to know what your jurisdictional or organizational plans are. Um, know what your particular roles and responsibilities are, whether you're a county board member, whether you're a county treasurer, a county clerk. Know how you fit into those plans, and we'll cover each one of these in depth. We also encourage you to get to know and support your first responders. Regardless of what kind of disaster hits your community or your county, odds are your law enforcement, your firefighters, your ambulance crews, those are going to be the ones who are responding initially. So make sure that they have the supplies and the training that they need to be able to respond. Number 3 is disasters begin and end locally. You know, we think of disasters, we think of things like Katrina, the floods of 2008, you know, the massive destruction. Oftentimes, our disasters are much smaller. Um, there's always at least one here in Illinois, a small town that gets hit by a tornado almost every year. And those are typically not large enough to escalate up to a state or federal disaster. So being prepared and having plans in place locally are crucial for the survival of our communities. No amount of recovery substitutes for preparedness and mitigation. And this is like the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Knowing that being prepared is going to make things much easier for recovery. You're not going to prevent a tornado from coming through your community, but if you have processes and plans in place, you can help the recovery along much faster. And then finally, preparedness is not an event, it's a process. And keeping that conversation going throughout the community on an ongoing basis is crucially important. At a bare minimum, there should be an annual meeting looking at your disaster planning, your mitigation planning, those kinds of things, because oftentimes you'll have names and such noted in there that are no longer involved, people that have passed away, buildings that are no longer available to be a emergency shelter, those kinds of things. So knowing that and updating your plans is crucial. One of the first things as a county official you can do is take the online courses through NIMS, which is the National Incident Management System. And if you go on the FEMA website or just Google NIMS, you will find a list of free online courses that you can take. You are actually required to take at least one of these courses by your position as a county official. And you can work with your emergency manager who has to certify that as to which one is appropriate for you to take. And these are based on the Incident Command Structure, that's the ICS. And those presentations that you can watch are crucially important because it gives you an overview of what your responsibilities are, what happens at the local level, how it gets escalated up to a state level, and then finally to a federal level. So it's really important for you to watch those, and for me, I try to go back every 5 or 6 years and watch them again because, you know, you have a tendency to forget, but it's basically a system that can scale up or scale back depending on how difficult a disaster is. As you can see by that picture, that was taken by some friends in Henderson County, Illinois. That is actually on Route 34 going out of Illinois into Iowa. And so you can see that even in Illinois, we get some pretty desperate situations. So also knowing your roles and responsibilities is incredibly important, because as a county official, you do have some responsibility towards public safety and welfare, whether it be the budgeting, whether it be hiring, regardless of your particular role. You also have that role, or may have the role, of providing appropriate guidance to the organizations or the departments within your jurisdiction that are responsible for disaster response, recovery, those kinds of things. The disaster declaration process is also something, especially if you're a county board member. Typically, that is going to go through the county board chair to ask the state to come in and assist when it's appropriate. And then the state would then ask the federal government to come in when and if appropriate. So that the county board is sort of the first step along the way. Or if it's a particular community, a community mayor may ask the county, and then the county then escalates it. So it's really important to know how to do those kinds of things. Supporting your first responders is incredibly important, and often we get busy and forget that we need to know who we're talking to in the time of a disaster. So I always encourage county officials to get to know who's in charge of their emergency personnel prior to a disaster, whether it be whether you have a full-time emergency manager. Some of you may have counties that are large enough for that. Your emergency manager may be your fire chief. It may be someone that is associated with the health department, but someone within your county in Illinois has that title. So getting to know them, the fire and rescue squads, all of your different law enforcement agencies, the ambulance and paramedic teams. If you have a medical reserve corps associated with your health department, and the state of Illinois really tries to make sure all of our health departments have a medical reserve corps, or you may have heard it referred to as the MRC. That's important. If you have a group of volunteer agencies that could be formed as a community organizations active in disaster group, or they may call themselves a voluntary organization active in disaster group. But those groups are not first responders, but they're support agencies and provide a lot of functions to assist in the recovery and volunteer management in the time of a disaster. So those are really important to know, whether you have those in your counties, and if so, who is in charge of those, who's the president. And those are set up as a support to the emergency manager. Saying that disasters start and end locally is super easy to say, but it's a reality that most people don't understand, simply because we see so much on the news of these terrible disasters, and think, oh, and we always hear FEMA's there to help, and they got a congressional appointment. Unfortunately, small disasters typically don't get that kind of media coverage, and almost always, even if it does get a federal declaration, the federal government leaves long before the recovery is complete. The recovery from Hurricane Katrina took at least a decade, and some will say that it is still ongoing across the Gulf Coast of the US. So it's important to know that while there is assistance to help, a lot of the heavy lifting is going to be done at the local level when it comes to disaster recovery. And in order to make sure that that is facilitated as best as possible, make sure that you, your county board, your other offices are available to the emergency manager. They're going to have to help coordinate recovery funds, those kind of things that are going to come through the county's accounts. all sorts of little detail things that will be ongoing um, throughout the recovery process. And recognize that the recovery is not going to happen overnight, and things rarely go back to what is quote unquote normal. They're not going to go back to the way they were before. Nobody's going to wave a magic wand. So if any of you have been through one of these disasters, you know that the best you can hope for is a new normal, and helping create that structure that allows people to recover and businesses to recover to the new normal that's going to be present after a large-scale disaster like this. If the disaster was large enough for a federal declaration, the state and federal officials are going to leave, but there's going to be all sorts of funding streams that are coming through, and those you're going to have to manage for a long time. And so it's important to think about who is in charge of that long-term recovery committee. Many times, if you have a coed or if you have a long-term recovery committee, it may be chaired or facilitated by a local foundation, a local not-for-profit. And it's important to think about those things because many of the disaster relief funds that you may be eligible for will not give to a unit of local government. They will only give to a not-for-profit. So I always encourage a community to establish a coed, get a fiscal agent agreement with a not-for-profit that can help facilitate those grants being written and brought into your community. And so it's just one more tool that you can do in advance to make sure that your community and your county is ready for a disaster. No amount of recovery substitutes for preparedness and mitigation. And if you talk to your emergency manager, they are going to tell you about probably 20 different types of plans that they have to have. They have to have an emergency operations plan. They have to have a hazard mitigation plan. They like to have a volunteer management plan. There are just tons of things and moving parts when it comes to planning for disasters. The key is, and probably some of you have seen and been involved in some exercises that your emergency management responders and hospitals and such may do. And the reason they do that is because the only way they can know if their plan is going to be effective is to practice it. And once they practice, they can make alterations to that plan. I encourage county officials to participate in those exercises because that way, if they think they can do something, when you go back and do the hot wash and say, no, really, this role or responsibility falls under this office. Or you could say, oh, but actually we do need you to do this. So it's important, if possible, for you to participate in those full-scale exercises and even tabletop exercises that might be done to think about how disasters might happen and how you might be able to assist during those times. You can also participate by helping the emergency manager or helping coeds or organizations do mitigation measures. And mitigation really is just doing something that's going to reduce the risk to life and property. So many of them will cost no money, such as educating your residents about where they should tune for the most current information, helping them determine what needs to be in an emergency preparedness kit that they keep at their home or their business. You know, you start getting into some more costly measures when you talk about structural mitigation. And when we talk about structural mitigation, we're basically talking about like a hardened room, a tornado shelter. That's a structural mitigation. If you build a tornado shelter for the school or a public building or a community, or you could talk about buyouts. We've done a lot of buyouts in Illinois in the floodplain. Or you could talk about elevations. Many of you that have floodplains in your jurisdictions may be aware that you have building codes in order to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program that require a structure built in the floodplain to be at least at base flood elevation. In some areas in Henderson County, nearby to me, that means in the floodplain down by Gulfport in that picture you saw, a building that is built in the floodplain has to be elevated, I believe, at 22.5 feet. So knowing those kinds of things, and hopefully that will prevent people from building big buildings in the floodplain, because I would get tired of climbing that number of steps. But that is a structural mitigation effort, and that's why you see cabins and such raised to that level. Also knowing the policies and procedures that you can implement to mitigate disasters. Making sure you have those building codes in the floodplain. Thinking about how a new structure is going to impact your likelihood to flood, or even for erosion, those kinds of things, how it's going to impact the stormwater drainage, because unfortunately in most floodplains, it's not only the riverine flooding that can cause issues, it is the runoff of into drainage systems as well that can cause some real issues. So knowing what your policies and procedures are is helpful when mitigating for disasters. Finally, creating an ongoing conversation. You know, we have suggested to some counties that they might have the emergency manager report to the county board, make a report on what's going on every quarter or so, maybe every 6 months, at the bare minimum every year, so that you know as a county official what's going on in the disaster preparedness of your community and the county that you're responsible for. Talking about this stuff in the blue sky times, which is basically when there's no disaster, makes a more resilient community. Making sure that you're talking about things and that you're getting as prepared as you can. That's what we mean by disaster resilient communities. And there's always something, new research, something that can be done to help you become more resilient. And it doesn't have to cost a lot of money either. You as an official need to know what your responsibilities are when it comes to disaster preparedness. And then if you don't have a role in response, is there a committee that you can be on, that you can be doing something so you feel like you're part of the recovery once the recovery starts taking place? And for most people, disaster recovery starts the minute the responders start responding, because part of recovery is helping your residents get back to normal. So whether it be housing them, feeding them, that's all part of the recovery process. And making sure that you're working with local businesses, organizations, and residents to make sure everybody's as prepared as they can be. Those are the things that you can do that don't cost any money, that you can find support with through your emergency manager or your extension office, to find ways that you can be more prepared in your jurisdiction. You can find lots of information by going to FEMA, by going to the National VOAD page, which the National VOAD is the national organizations involved in disaster recovery, like Red Cross, Salvation Army, Catholic Charities, those kinds of organizations. And they have lots of information on their website. And also the extensiondisaster.net, that is Eden's website. And we have information. You can drill down to us at University of Illinois Extension, or you can just go to Illinois Extension's website as well. And then finally, if you ever have any questions, feel free To contact me, my name is Carrie McKillip. My email is McKillip, which is McKillip @illinois.edu. If I can't answer your question, I will try to find someone who can, and hopefully hook you up with a local extension staff person who might be willing to have that conversation and assist you as you try to become more disaster resilient in your communities. Thanks. Anne, I think I've completed. Is there anything that came to your mind that you might need clarification on?
Thanks, Carrie. I really appreciate you spending this time with us, just describing an approach to disaster preparedness and how Extension can help at the county level. I wanted to ask you a couple questions for further clarification. I know that you've worked with counties across the state of Illinois, and could you give an example of the kind of result of that planning, and then also how that county might call you in to help with disaster preparedness planning?
Well, and there's a couple different ways. I have done and worked with several counties on their um, multi-jurisdictional disaster mitigation plans. And those are actually required by the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. And in order for a community to receive mitigation dollars to help with buyouts or elevations and such that I mentioned, you have to have a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan. And you can check with your emergency manager to see if you have those or have one. And most counties in Illinois now have those, and those need to be updated every year. And there is funding available through the pre-disaster mitigation funds to apply for a grant to get those updated. Most counties have used contractors, but there are a lot of rural counties who contractors charge an awful lot. We know that trying to get to our counties can be challenging. So contractors may or may not want to bid on those. And we have done some of those in counties where we have a good relationship with the county board, and we can help them secure those grants, facilitate the development of those plans. What's really important in those planning processes is engaging the community, and that's something that we at Extension do well, is finding out who has the knowledge base to help develop these plans, bringing people together and coming up with creative plans. Once those plans are in place, then the participating jurisdictions are eligible for mitigation dollars should they become available. The other thing that I really, really want to see more people in Illinois get involved with, and hopefully Extension throughout Illinois can assist, is developing local community organizations active in disaster groups. And that is basically bringing together citizens or residents and not-for-profit organizations, and thinking about things like how and where are we going to shelter people if we get hit by a tornado? How are we going to manage volunteers that just show up? Because as we all know, when a disaster happens, there's a lot of people that want to go and help, which is wonderful, but you have to have a mechanism to monitor that, to keep everybody safe. And so you have to have a structure for that. The Long-Term Recovery Committee that I mentioned is one committee of a community organizations active in disaster group. Anyone who's interested, who has talked to their emergency manager to find out if you have one. Odds are if you had one, you'd know that. But if you don't, you can contact either me and I can find someone who might be able to assist you, or Anne, and hopefully your extension office would be willing to work with you and at least help you get that group coordinated, bring everybody to the table. And why we think that's important is because there's so much the business aspect of it, the agriculture, and most of you know that Extension is is pretty well versed in agriculture. What are you going to do with animals in the event of a disaster? Those kind of things. So those are the kinds of things that we can help. If you come to us, we can see what we can do to help you get those organized so you're more disaster resilient.
So Carrie, I had a whole list of questions. You did answer some of them, but would you
Okay.
say once again, how do you find out if you have a plan and where that plan resides?
Your emergency manager has to provide those to the Illinois Emergency Management Agency. So that would be my first call.
Okay.
They are the ones that are responsible for developing and submitting a county's emergency management operations plan. And so they will also help run the exercises and such.
Okay, you mentioned several times coeds, community organizations active in disaster. So can you
Correct.
talk a little bit more about the important role that a coed might have and how you might find out who is on your list of coeds in your county?
Absolutely. Well, a coed, or community organizations active in disasters, really are sort of a support network for the emergency manager. If you have a well-planned, well-organized coed, when a disaster strikes, the emergency manager will call the chair of the coed and say, hey, I need you to stand up the emergency shelter, and we need volunteer management. And then the chair of that coed will then call those committee chairs, and they will know exactly what to do, because that allows the emergency manager to function as they should on the emergency response. These ancillary items are things that there are groups and organizations that know how to do. For example, in most coeds in the state of Illinois, Red Cross is a member, and they have a list of where they can have an emergency shelter in your county. And they will, if they know that you have 10 families that need shelter, they will get an emergency shelter stood up immediately. You probably would also have a volunteer or a donations committee. And so in the event of a disaster that takes out people's homes, people like to donate cleaning supplies, clothing, paper products. Someone has to manage that, and it can't be the emergency manager because they're busy doing all the other things. So those are the kinds of things that a coed can do and lend to a response and recovery effort. They also can start transitioning into that long-term recovery by helping secure funding for whether it be case management, um, appliance, unmet needs funds, those kind of things. And that's why I mentioned, as we were talking, the not-for-profit, having those 501c3s available to be fiscal agents so that you can maximize the resources available for recovery efforts.
Carrie, you had that very compelling example of the hardened room that kept people safe during that tornado.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, as part of county government, one of the things that you have responsibility for is this general response to disaster in your county, but you also have responsibility, or at least thinking about, for your own county employees, how do you keep them safe? And so is it possible to create what you called a hardened room in an existing building, such as a county courthouse or another county facility? What are counties doing about that?
It is possible, and FEMA actually has construction guidelines. If you go to FEMA's website, you can get construction guidelines, and there are certain, and I am not an architect or an engineer, so I can't really answer this, but there are certain requirements, and especially if you're going to build a new public safety building or a new courthouse or something like that, you should consider having a hardened room, a wind resistant room that could protect your staff, and especially as we see more and more severe storms in the Midwest, our number of um, uh, F3 tornadoes and above are really increasing. Thinking about that, we'd also encourage local school districts, cities and villages. If you're building a new building, that's the time to try to incorporate those guidelines. And you can go on FEMA's website and download those instructions. And most architects that you might hire or engineering firms know how to access those, and make sure you're talking to them about wanting to incorporate those in your construction designs as well.
Thanks, Carrie. So I'm sure there
Not
might
a
be other
problem.
questions, and I'm glad you provided your email. You just want to say your email one more time, just to make sure everybody has it. And if you don't want to just listen to Carrie's email, it's available on our University of Illinois Extension website too. But Carrie, list your email one more time.
It is mckillip@illinois.edu, and McKillip is spelled MCKILLIP at Illinois spelled out .edu.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks so much for joining us today, and for your offer to provide continuing answers to questions, and also to help counties think about how they might develop a plan for disaster mitigation and preparedness. Thank you.
Thank you.